This is my true story. I spent my life loving my son, guiding him, and giving everything I had. But one day, he looked at me and said, "You're just a useless old man." Those words cut deeper than any wound, breaking my heart. I never expected the child I raised with patience and sacrifice to treat me with such cruelty. I realized it was time for action, not silence. I called the police and showed them everything, ensuring he faced the consequences. Before I share the rest, tell me where you're watching from and the time there, and please subscribe so my story reaches more people. I spent decades working long hours, day and night, to make sure my son had everything he needed. I woke before dawn to earn money, came home late, exhausted, but always made time to ask if he had eaten, if he needed anything. I skipped meals, sometimes going hungry myself so that he could have his favorite foods, his comforts, and the life I dreamed he would enjoy. Every piece of clothing I wore, every worn-out shoe, every penny I saved was for him, for his future, for the hope that he would succeed and grow into a man who understood respect. I never asked for anything in return, only the quiet assurance that he would honor me as a father. I believed that loyalty and love would naturally come back in the form of care and gratitude. I believed that every sacrifice, every sleepless night, every moment I spent working while he slept peacefully would one day be recognized and valued. I thought that a son, raised with patience, guidance, and love, would naturally repay that effort with respect, understanding, and kindness as he grew. I thought that family bonds were unbreakable, that blood was stronger than anger or pride, and that my son would always carry my name with honor. I believed that my work, my sweat, my tears, and my choices were investments in the man my son would become. I saw every struggle I endured, every long hour, every burden I bore as a brick laid in the foundation of his life, and I never doubted that he would one day acknowledge and respect the sacrifices I had made. I gave him education, opportunities, and guidance, hoping he would be prepared for the challenges of life and for the responsibilities of adulthood. I worked tirelessly to shield him from hardships, thinking that a father's job was to bear the weight of the world so that his child could walk lightly. I taught him values, manners, and patience through example and through lessons I thought would stick. I believed that a child nurtured with care and discipline would grow into a man who knew the difference between right and wrong, who would value family and honor the sacrifices that brought him to his position. I endured criticism silently, complaints from others, and my own fears of inadequacy, thinking that love meant giving without counting the cost. I spent nights worrying about his future, about the roads he would take, about the company he would keep, about the kind of man he would become. Every choice I made, from the smallest daily decision to the most significant financial sacrifice, was calculated to build him a life of stability and opportunity. I never allowed my doubts to show. I bore them privately because a father must always seem strong, unshaken, and unwavering, even when inside he was breaking. I believed that my endurance, my persistence, and my loyalty would be mirrored in his respect and gratitude, that he would naturally rise to the man I had envisioned, carrying my teachings, my name, and my pride forward. I never imagined that the love I gave freely, the effort I invested endlessly, and the patience I maintained despite exhaustion could ever be met with disdain, disrespect, or cruelty. I assumed that my son would always recognize the difference between temporary frustrations and lifelong devotion, and that he would honor the man who gave him everything with acknowledgement, respect, and care. I thought that the sacrifices I endured quietly, the hardships I bore without complaint, and the sleepless nights spent worrying about his safety and happiness were the foundation of a relationship built on love, trust, and gratitude. I never imagined that he could see me as weak or useless, that the very man who had carried his burdens, taught him lessons, and provided him with life and opportunity could ever be dismissed or insulted. I assumed that our bond, built over years of effort, patience, and devotion, would protect against anger, rebellion, or disrespect. I never questioned that my actions were right, my intentions noble, and my sacrifices meaningful, because I had given everything without expecting reward, only love and recognition in return. I believed that my sacrifices would be remembered in quiet moments of reflection, that my work would stand as proof of my devotion, and that my son would eventually see that love expressed in deeds is worth more than love expressed in words. I spent decades building, giving, and guiding, thinking that the natural course of life would repay me in the form of gratitude, respect, and familial bond. I thought that a life spent serving another, especially one's own child, could never be dishonored or disregarded. I never expected that the very person I raised, protected, and loved above all else would one day look at me and declare me worthless, that my decades of sacrifice would be dismissed as if they meant nothing. I worked endlessly, thinking that love required effort, patience, and unwavering commitment, never imagining that love could be met with contempt, disrespect, or hatred. I gave all I had, sacrificed all I could, and endured all the struggles life placed before me, believing that a father's role is to give, protect, and teach. I believed that the bond of family, strengthened by years of devotion, sacrifice, and care, would always protect against insults, rebellion, or disregard. I thought that a son raised with guidance, love, and patience would naturally respond with respect, understanding, and acknowledgement. I never imagined that the one I nurtured, taught, and loved would one day become the source of pain, shame, and disrespect, seeing me not as a father, but as a burden, a useless old man, unworthy of recognition or care. I spent my life believing in love, loyalty, and family, assuming that my devotion would create a son who honored, respected, and valued the sacrifices made for him, and never imagining that those sacrifices could be met with betrayal, cruelty, or disdain. As my son grew older, I began noticing subtle changes in his tone, the way he looked at me, and the way he spoke. What used to be polite words and respectful gestures slowly became sharp tones and impatient sighs. He began ignoring advice I offered, dismissing guidance as unnecessary or foolish. Small achievements I celebrated for him were met with indifference or sarcasm. I noticed laughter at things I didn't understand, secret smiles when I spoke seriously, and eye rolls that I could not ignore. At first, I told myself it was just youthful rebellion, that teenagers and young adults often test boundaries. I hoped that with patience and continued guidance, he would return to the respectful boy I had raised. I remembered the long nights spent teaching him right from wrong, the sacrifices I made to provide opportunities, and the dreams I held for his future. I tried to be patient, telling myself that he would come back to me in time. But over months, the disrespect grew heavier, more deliberate, and harder to ignore. He mocked my struggles in front of others, laughed at my age, and dismissed my advice as obsolete. Friends and neighbors began noticing his behavior too, giving me worried glances and cautious words. They whispered about how he seemed ungrateful, but I continued to endure silently, hoping that love, time, and patience would teach him humility. I noticed that he had begun to take pleasure in minor insults, finding joy in teasing me about my slow movements, old habits, and the things I could no longer do as I once could. Each laugh, each remark, each dismissive gesture chipped away at the years of patience I had held inside. I felt a quiet anger growing, but I kept it hidden. I reminded myself that a father must endure, must remain steady, and must lead by example, even when met with contempt. Sometimes I would sit quietly, reflecting on the years spent providing for him. I had worked tirelessly to ensure he had every advantage, every comfort, and every opportunity. I had given him love without hesitation, guidance without complaint, and protection without seeking reward. Yet he seemed blind to it all, treating me not as a father, but as a nuisance. My patience was tested daily, my pride bruised repeatedly, and my heart heavy with sorrow. I began keeping track in my mind, noting the subtle changes, the increasing disrespect, and the small acts of defiance. I realized that ignoring these signs had not prevented the problem. In fact, it may have encouraged it. I knew that the longer I allowed him to behave this way without consequence, the deeper the wounds would grow. I began thinking that one day this disrespect might turn into something more serious, perhaps even dangerous, and I had to prepare. Even though my body aged, my mind remained alert, aware of the shifts in his behavior. I remembered that a father's role is to protect, guide, and correct when necessary. I reminded myself that patience has limits, and respect must be enforced, not only expected. The time for subtle reminders and gentle nudges was passing, and I had to be ready to act if the abuse continued. I realized that words alone would no longer suffice to restore the balance between us. The laughter behind closed doors, the sarcasm in his words, and the constant dismissal of my presence became unbearable over time. I thought about the sacrifices I had made, countless hours of work, skipped meals, and endless worry for his safety and well-being. I thought about the nights I stayed awake fearing for his future, and the mornings I rose tired but determined to provide yet another day of opportunity. I understood that a son who saw me as weak or useless was dangerous not only to me, but to the family structure. I realized that if I did not take decisive action, this pattern would continue indefinitely, eroding the values I had tried so hard to instill. I began planning silently, preparing myself mentally for the steps I would need to take to regain control and ensure justice. By the time he shouted the words that would break my heart completely, I had already understood that patience alone would not protect me. I had seen the signs of growing disrespect, arrogance, and entitlement, and I knew that the moment of reckoning was approaching. I knew that actions would now speak louder than years of advice, guidance, and silent suffering. I had reached the point where I realized that to protect myself and restore dignity, I would have to take matters into my own hands. I spent hours reflecting on what my response should be, knowing that I had to act in a way that was calm, measured, and undeniable. I would not let my emotions guide me recklessly, nor would I allow shame to paralyze me. I began gathering evidence in my mind, recalling the bruises, insults, and patterns of abuse, understanding that this record would become my shield and my voice. The pattern of disrespect had been relentless. Every day brought another reminder that the boy I had raised had changed into someone unrecognizable. His respect was gone, replaced by contempt, and his behavior threatened to define the relationship unless corrected. I realized that a father's patience, while admirable, must be paired with decisive action to protect the self and enforce boundaries. I understood that the time for hope had passed. Waiting for change through gentle guidance had failed. I resolved that I would act in a way that was not only effective but also permanent, a lesson that would be remembered and would ensure that the abuse could never continue unchecked. I reminded myself that dignity, respect, and safety are worth more than pride, even the pride of a parent enduring for decades. I prepared mentally for the steps ahead, understanding that the path to justice would require courage, clarity, and calm resolve. I reminded myself that the years of patience and sacrifice were not wasted, but they had set the stage for the moment when truth and action would triumph over disrespect and cruelty. I accepted that the son I had raised was no longer the boy of my hopes, but that through decisive action, I could correct the imbalance and reclaim my dignity. I reflected on the journey that had brought me here, years of love, endless sacrifice, sleepless nights, and constant vigilance. Each act of patience, each silent endurance had prepared me for this moment when words alone would no longer suffice. I resolved to act with precision, ensuring that justice would be done, and that the disrespect and abuse would finally meet consequences. By the end of it, I knew that I could not let the disrespect continue. I had seen the signs, felt the pain, and understood that patience must now give way to action. The time had come to reclaim respect, dignity, and peace, to ensure that the years of abuse would not define the rest of my life. One day, the insult came like a thunderbolt that shattered my heart. My son, with all the arrogance he had cultivated over the years, shouted words I could never have imagined. "You're worth less than my dog." The phrase struck deeper than any physical blow, sharper than any argument we had ever had. I froze, feeling decades of sacrifice and love vanish in an instant. Every sleepless night, every missed meal, every moment of guidance I had given him felt erased. My body trembled, but my mind began to focus. I replayed those words over and over in my head, understanding the weight behind them. It was not only disrespect, but complete devaluation of my life, my efforts, and my presence. For years, I had worked tirelessly to provide for him, to nurture him, and to guide him. Yet, in that single sentence, he reduced me to nothing, comparing my worth to that of an animal. The shock and heartbreak cut through me, igniting a fire of resolve I had never known. I remembered the sacrifices I had made for his comfort and success. Long hours of labor, skipped meals, and moments of rest abandoned so he could have what he needed. I thought of the nights I worried for his safety, the mornings I rose tired but determined to face another day of providing. Each memory collided with the sting of his words, fueling a mix of grief and determination. I understood that this insult could not be left unanswered. It was not the first time he had been cruel, but this moment crystallized the reality that respect had been replaced with contempt. My patience, my silent endurance, and my attempts at guidance had all failed to instill gratitude or humility. The years of love I had poured into him now seemed to demand justice, a lesson that he could not ignore. I realized that to protect my dignity, I would need to act decisively and calmly. I spent hours reflecting on the insult, considering the consequences of ignoring it versus responding. I knew that words alone would no longer suffice to restore respect or enforce boundaries. His arrogance had grown alongside his disregard for family, and only a clear, undeniable action could counterbalance the damage. I understood that justice had to be visible, a statement not only to him but to anyone who might witness the abuse. I remembered the bruises I had endured in private, the moments when his anger turned physical, and I had hidden the evidence beneath long sleeves. Pain and humiliation had become my companions, yet I had remained silent. But now, with the insult fresh in my memory, I recognized that silence had allowed cruelty to thrive. I decided that this time, action would speak louder than endurance. The insult had opened my eyes fully to the pattern of abuse. I realized that the repeated disrespect, the dismissive gestures, and the mockery of my presence could no longer be tolerated. I resolved that I would gather proof, present it to the authorities, and ensure that the world, not just myself, understood the extent of his cruelty. This was not about revenge alone, but about restoring dignity and establishing boundaries. I began documenting everything, recalling incidents, collecting evidence, and making mental notes of the patterns. Each act of cruelty, each physical aggression, each insult became part of a record that I would use to demonstrate the truth. I knew that patience had limits, and that to safeguard my well-being and restore balance, I needed to act. The insult had become the catalyst for a necessary and decisive response. Thinking back, I understood that love and patience, while essential in raising a child, must sometimes be paired with firmness and action when they are met with sustained cruelty. I had tried to guide him, to teach him respect through example, and to endure without retaliation. Yet, in that instant, when he placed my worth below that of a dog, I realized that love alone was insufficient to protect dignity. The insult burned through my thoughts day and night, but it also clarified my path. I could not allow him to continue unchecked, nor could I let fear or shame prevent me from reclaiming my authority and dignity. Every thought of the abuse, every recollection of physical pain, strengthened my resolve to act decisively. I understood that the moment had arrived to make the consequences undeniable and permanent. I reflected on my life, the countless sacrifices I had made, and the love I had given without hesitation. I realized that enduring this insult without response would nullify all the efforts I had made, all the guidance I had provided, and all the values I had tried to instill. Respect could not be demanded. It had to be earned and enforced. This moment would be the turning point, the moment when boundaries would finally be established. As I prepared mentally for what I would do next, I reminded myself to remain calm and precise. Anger could cloud judgment, but clarity and planning would ensure the lesson was effective. I knew that the insult was not just words. It represented years of escalating disrespect and contempt. I resolved that the response must be decisive, visible, and irrevocable, leaving no room for denial or minimization. The insult also reminded me that family relationships require mutual respect, and when that respect is abandoned, corrective action is necessary. I understood that this was not only a personal matter, but a reflection of the values I had spent decades teaching. By acting, I would ensure that my dignity was restored and that the lessons of respect and consequence were unmistakable. I envisioned the steps I would take, the evidence I would gather, and the authorities I would involve. The insult had ignited a clear understanding. Words could wound, but truth and action could heal and protect. I prepared myself to face the situation calmly, knowing that a measured, deliberate response would carry more power than any emotional outburst. By the end of the day, I had made my plan. The insult had transformed into clarity, resolve, and preparation. I knew exactly what I would do to restore order, dignity, and respect in my life. I understood that this decisive moment would serve as both a lesson for him and a reclaiming of the authority I had earned through decades of sacrifice. The insult had shattered my heart, but it also awakened a resolve that had lain dormant. I recognized that this moment, though painful, was the turning point for justice and respect. I felt a sense of purpose, knowing that every action I would take moving forward would restore balance, protect myself, and demonstrate that even an elderly man's dignity cannot be dismissed. Behind closed doors, the abuse continued in silence, each day adding another layer of pain that I carried alone. Bruises appeared on my arms, back, and face, hidden beneath long sleeves, concealing the evidence of suffering from the outside world. My pride prevented me from showing weakness, even as the marks grew darker and more numerous. Each insult, each slap, each act of aggression felt like a stone added to a growing pile of despair. Nights became the hardest time, lying awake while replaying the cruelty I had endured. The words he spoke, the disrespect he showed, echoed in my mind like a relentless drum, reminding me that the child I had raised was now the source of my deepest sorrow. I reflected on the countless sacrifices I had made for him, the sleepless nights, the long hours, the meals skipped to make sure he ate, the guidance offered with love and patience. All of it seemed worthless in the face of his disdain. It was not just the physical pain that weighed me down. It was the heartbreak of realizing that my son, whom I had loved unconditionally, now treated me as though I were nothing. Each day, the emotional bruises deepened, leaving scars that were invisible but felt in every heartbeat, every thought, every moment of solitude. Still, amidst the suffering, a quiet resolve began to take root within me. I knew that silence had allowed the abuse to continue for far too long. Enduring in secret had not protected anyone. It had only given him more power. The love I had for my family now demanded action, and I began to see that the only path forward was one that would combine courage with justice. The idea of retaliation was not born of hatred, but of the need to reclaim my dignity and ensure that the pain I endured would have meaning beyond suffering. I began documenting everything in detail. Every bruise, every insult, every act of aggression was noted carefully. Photos were taken when possible, and every incident was written down with dates and descriptions. This evidence became a silent witness to my struggle, a shield that would one day allow me to confront the injustice in a way that words alone never could. Collecting this proof became a daily ritual, a reminder that I still had control over my life, even when his hands and words sought to dominate me. I thought constantly about the moment when the truth would be revealed, when the world could see what I had endured in silence. The thought of him facing the consequences of his actions brought a quiet satisfaction, not for revenge alone, but for justice and restoration. It was a vision of the scales being balanced, of respect being demanded not through threats or anger, but through the undeniable facts of his behavior. Each bruise and mark would speak louder than anything I could ever say, telling the story of betrayal and cruelty that had been hidden too long. The nights spent in reflection became a training ground for my mind and spirit. I learned patience in suffering, clarity in decision-making, and strength in restraint. Each painful memory fueled my determination to act thoughtfully, to ensure that when the time came, the response would be measured, precise, and impactful. I realized that enduring pain silently had taught me an unexpected lesson: resilience. It was a resilience that would carry me through the next steps, through the moment of reporting, and beyond, allowing me to confront the injustice with dignity intact. As the weeks passed, I grew increasingly aware that my silence had limits. There was a threshold beyond which tolerance could no longer exist. The physical evidence, combined with the mental and emotional toll, reached a point where it became impossible to ignore. My body ached, my heart ached, and my spirit demanded action. The choice became clear: endure and continue suffering in secret, or take a stand and reclaim the life and dignity that had been stripped from me. The decision was not made lightly, but it was made with certainty, knowing that my courage would restore not just my own self-respect, but also set a precedent for accountability. In this period of silent suffering, I also reflected on the nature of love and respect. I realized that true love does not involve humiliation, and respect is not given freely when one is willing to inflict pain on those they claim to care about. Understanding this allowed me to separate my feelings of paternal love from the need for justice. I knew I could still love my child while taking steps to protect myself and ensure he faced consequences. This duality became the guiding principle for the actions I would soon take. Finally, the silent suffering reached its purpose. It prepared me for the decisive moment when I would confront the abuse through legal means. It was a period of preparation, of gathering strength, and of clarifying my intentions. The physical bruises would remain as proof, the emotional scars as reminders, but neither would define the conclusion of my story. I would act with authority, clarity, and resolve, transforming years of silent suffering into a force that demanded recognition and respect. The journey through silent suffering was long and painful, but it forged a determination that no words could break. It was a crucible that taught me endurance, courage, and strategy. By holding on to this resolve, I could face the moment of confrontation with a clear mind and a steady heart. My suffering had meaning, and it would lead to justice. The quiet moments of pain had created the foundation for a decisive, dignified response that would ensure the lessons of disrespect and cruelty would be permanently recorded in the memory of my son and all who witnessed the consequences. After weeks of silent suffering and careful documentation, I realized that the time for patience had passed. Enduring abuse in silence had taught me resilience, but it had not ended the cruelty. Each day of fear, each moment of insult and violence had shown me that words alone could not restore dignity or demand respect. I knew that action, deliberate and precise, was now required. The decision had to be made carefully, without haste or anger, and with full awareness of its impact. I weighed every possibility, considering the consequences of confrontation, of waiting, and of taking legal steps. I understood that raising my voice or retaliating physically would accomplish nothing. Such actions could escalate the situation, damage my credibility, and fail to protect me in the long run. My goal was not revenge born of passion, but justice founded on truth. I wanted a solution that would be effective, permanent, and undeniable. Each scenario played out in my mind, carefully analyzed, until the path forward became clear. The first step in my plan involved gathering evidence that could no longer be ignored. Bruises, scratches, and marks were photographed meticulously. Every act of aggression, every verbal insult, every instance of disrespect was recorded in writing. Dates, times, and detailed descriptions were carefully noted. This record was not created to shame my son impulsively, but to provide a clear, factual account of the abuse. It was my shield and my weapon, ensuring that when the authorities were involved, the truth could not be denied. I also considered the emotional weight of my actions. Taking steps against one's own child is never easy. Love and duty had shaped my entire life, and the thought of involving the police brought a mixture of sorrow, fear, and determination. I recognized that my decision would change family dynamics forever, and that there would be whispers, judgments, and scrutiny. But I reminded myself that enduring abuse in silence had already taken a toll on my body, mind, and spirit. Protecting myself was no longer optional. It was necessary. As I prepared mentally, I practiced calm and steady resolve. I rehearsed the steps I would take, ensuring my approach would be measured and dignified. There would be no shouting, no unnecessary confrontation, no emotional outbursts. I would present the facts, show the evidence, and allow the truth to speak for itself. The weight of this preparation gave me strength. I felt a growing certainty that justice could be achieved without sacrificing my integrity or composure. In addition to preparing the evidence, I also planned for the immediate aftermath. I knew that involving the authorities would provoke reactions from neighbors, friends, and extended family. Some would support me, others would question my actions, and my son would certainly be humiliated. But I understood that public accountability was necessary. The lesson of respect and the consequences of cruelty could not be hidden. The impact would be lasting, teaching him and the witnesses that actions have real-world consequences. I reminded myself repeatedly that this decision was not driven by vengeance. The anger and betrayal I had felt were real, but they were tempered by careful thought. My motivation was protection and restoration, proving that no abuse, no matter how long endured, could go unanswered. I envisioned the moment when the authorities would arrive, when my evidence would speak clearly, and when my son's arrogance would face the undeniable reality of his actions. This visualization strengthened my resolve. Finally, the quiet decision crystallized into a firm plan. I would contact the authorities, present my evidence, and allow the process to unfold according to the law. I would not raise my voice. I would not seek to embarrass him unnecessarily, and I would act with the dignity that had been tested for so long. This decision represented a turning point, not just in my relationship with my son, but in reclaiming control over my life, my safety, and my self-respect. In the days leading to the action, I continued to reflect on the lessons of suffering, resilience, and dignity. I reminded myself that my long years of sacrifice, patience, and guidance had not been wasted. They had prepared me to act wisely and effectively. This quiet decision, born from reflection and strategic thinking, was an extension of that lifelong commitment to doing what was right, even when it was difficult. It was an assertion that respect is not optional and that abuse must face consequences. The night before taking action, I sat in contemplation, reviewing the evidence one last time. I went over each incident, each photograph, each note, ensuring everything was complete and accurate. My mind was clear, my heart steady, and my body ready. The quiet decision had given me purpose, transforming the pain and humiliation I had endured into a path of justice. I felt a sense of empowerment I had not known since the abuse began. With the quiet decision made, I knew that the following day would mark the beginning of a new chapter. One where fear would no longer dictate my life and where respect would be demanded through truth and authority. The abuse would end, and the consequences would teach lessons that words alone could never convey. I had chosen my path deliberately, and I would follow it with unwavering resolve. This quiet decision was the culmination of years of suffering, patience, and strategic thought. It was a turning point that balanced love, justice, and dignity. It would be the foundation for restoring my life, reclaiming my voice, and ensuring that the abuse I endured would not continue. The path ahead would be challenging, but the preparation, reflection, and careful planning of this quiet decision gave me the strength to face it with confidence, integrity, and purpose. The moment my son stepped outside in handcuffs, the world around him seemed to shift. Neighbors, who had once turned blind eyes or whispered doubts, now observed the undeniable truth. Their eyes widened in shock as they saw the man who had insulted and harmed me now facing immediate consequences. The arrogance that had defined him, the pride that had masked cruelty, melted under public scrutiny. He could no longer hide behind charm, success, or excuses. Every observer bore witness to the reality of his actions. Each gasp, murmur, and whisper amplified the lesson I had long hoped he would learn. I watched calmly, heart steady, as reality sank in. His children, friends, and neighbors processed the spectacle. The young faces of his children, confused and wide-eyed, absorbed the lesson with clarity that words could not convey. They saw firsthand that harmful actions are never hidden, that abusive behavior carries inevitable consequences, and that the safety and dignity of others matter above all. The public nature of this exposure transformed the private pain I endured into a visible, undeniable record. For the first time, the cruelty he had inflicted could not be denied, excused, or ignored. I felt a quiet sense of justice as whispers traveled through the street. The image my son had carefully constructed, his sense of superiority and untouchable pride, crumbled before the judgment of witnesses. Friends and acquaintances who had previously admired or tolerated him now recognized the depth of his wrongdoing. Reputation, built over years of appearances and influence, collapsed in moments. I realized that public exposure carried a power that private admonishment never could. The shame, humiliation, and recognition of wrongdoing in front of others reinforced accountability in a way that solitude or private correction could never achieve. Even the neighbors who had been passive observers became participants in this lesson. Their gaze, judgment, and silent acknowledgement amplified the consequence. The son's attempt to maintain control over perception, to retain his status and pride, failed completely. He could not manipulate reality in the presence of witnesses and truth. Every move he made, every faltering step, was recorded in their memory. I understood that witnessing this transformation would leave an indelible impression, ensuring that accountability and respect were reinforced not only for him, but for all who observed. The reactions of those around him, from shock to murmured condemnation, reflected the severity of his actions. People who had previously doubted, minimized, or ignored the abuse now faced undeniable evidence of wrongdoing. The spectacle provided clarity, reinforced social boundaries, and restored a sense of moral order. I felt a quiet satisfaction in knowing that the lesson extended beyond our household. The consequences of disrespect and violence were visible, palpable, and unforgettable. Through public exposure, the abuse was no longer a hidden secret, but a story witnessed, acknowledged, and remembered by many. As he stood there, cuffed and humbled, the arrogance that had once filled the room was replaced by fear, shame, and realization. He could no longer assert dominance over me or any situation. Every sneer, insult, and act of cruelty he had committed became transparent under the eyes of the community. I understood that exposure was not revenge in its raw form, but a method of teaching, a powerful, lasting lesson that could not be erased. His reputation, carefully curated and guarded, was dismantled in a way that ensured he would never forget the consequences of his actions. I also reflected on the deeper meaning of public exposure. It served as a lesson for my children, his children, and everyone who witnessed the event. Respect, dignity, and accountability were reinforced through observation. Words and warnings often fail to impress upon the minds of the arrogant. Actions, undeniable and witnessed, leave a permanent mark. I understood that the community, now aware of the truth, would serve as a constant reminder that abusive behavior is unacceptable. This reinforced social order and personal boundaries in a way that private measures could never achieve. The shock, confusion, and embarrassment my son experienced were necessary components of the lesson. While painful to observe, the public exposure ensured that the cycle of abuse could not continue unchecked. Neighbors, once silent or complicit, now recognized the importance of intervention and observation. Their awareness created a support system that reinforced safety and respect. I felt a quiet sense of justice in knowing that the lesson would extend beyond my immediate experience. Public exposure amplified the consequences, ensuring that harm would not go unnoticed or unacknowledged. Even as the whispers settled and the crowd began to disperse, the impact of the exposure remained. My son's face, marked by shame and realization, would be remembered by all who saw it. The lesson was clear. Actions have consequences. Disrespect cannot be ignored, and abuse is never tolerated. I felt relief that the public, long witnesses to subtle signs of his arrogance or cruelty, now understood the truth. The gravity of his behavior was undeniable, and the restoration of my dignity was complete. The lesson, delivered through visibility and truth, could not be erased. Through the eyes of the community, I witnessed a transformation, not just in my son, but in the collective understanding of accountability. Respect was no longer assumed. It was enforced through observation, validation, and consequence. The power of public exposure became evident as a tool for justice, teaching lessons that words alone could not. I understood that this visibility would prevent future abuse, as the shame and recognition of wrongdoing left lasting impressions on both him and all who observed. The presence of neighbors, friends, and his children provided a sense of closure I had long sought. The visibility ensured that my suffering was acknowledged and that justice was neither hidden nor diminished. My son, once dismissive and cruel, was now humbled in a way that could not be denied or ignored. This public exposure reinforced moral and social boundaries, ensuring that the lessons of accountability, respect, and dignity were permanently embedded in his consciousness and remembered by those who had witnessed it. Even in the silence that followed, I felt the lasting impact of the exposure. The weight of years of abuse and disrespect had been addressed not only by law, but by the community's awareness. The lesson was comprehensive, undeniable, and permanent. My dignity, long undermined, was restored through careful planning, courage, and the undeniable power of truth. Public exposure ensured that the actions of cruelty were witnessed, recorded in memory, and met with rightful consequence. Justice, visible and lasting, had been delivered. After the public exposure of my son's actions, life began to shift in ways I had long hoped for, but never imagined would be so immediate. The house, once filled with tension, fear, and resentment, became calm. Every corner, every room, now carried the quiet of safety and order. The presence of law enforcement, the witnesses, and the undeniable truth of his abuse created a lasting transformation. My son's arrogance and cruelty had been replaced by silence, reflection, and shame. The power dynamics had shifted, and for the first time, I felt a sense of peace that had been absent for many years. The consequences of his actions extended beyond the moment of arrest. Legal authorities ensured that he faced appropriate repercussions, while friends, neighbors, and relatives now recognized the reality of his behavior. The whispers of doubt or denial were replaced by acknowledgement and validation of my suffering. His social standing, carefully built on charm and appearances, crumbled completely. The isolation that followed his public exposure reinforced the lesson that disrespect, abuse, and cruelty cannot be ignored. The restoration of my dignity was profound, not because of vengeance, but because truth and justice prevailed. Within the household, the change was tangible. The fear that had once governed conversations, the tension that made every interaction cautious, dissipated. The atmosphere became one of calm, safety, and mutual acknowledgement of boundaries. Respect, once absent, began to return in subtle ways. Neighbors who had previously avoided involvement now recognized the importance of vigilance and intervention. The lessons learned by my son were observed by all who remained connected to our family. The act of exposing the truth publicly ensured that the principles of accountability were reinforced and internalized. Emotionally, I felt a complex mixture of relief, sorrow, and quiet satisfaction. The pain of betrayal could not be erased, but its power over me diminished. I had endured years of insult, physical abuse, and emotional torment, yet through patience, courage, and decisive action, I reclaimed control of my life. The aftermath of justice allowed me to see the long-term consequences of his actions, not just on himself, but on his relationships, reputation, and future interactions. Accountability had a tangible presence, ensuring that abuse could not repeat unchecked. Even as the legal process continued, I maintained a quiet vigilance. Observing my son navigate the consequences of his behavior reinforced the importance of intervention and courage. He could no longer deny, hide, or manipulate the truth. The lasting impression of shame, combined with the legal and social repercussions, became an enduring reminder of the principles he had violated. The aftermath was not just about immediate justice. It was about instilling understanding, reshaping behavior, and protecting future generations from similar harm. The impact on his children, my grandchildren, was significant. Witnessing the consequences firsthand instilled clarity and comprehension that words alone could never achieve. They observed that actions have consequences, that abuse is unacceptable, and that respect is not optional. The transformation in the household extended to the younger generation, reinforcing the importance of empathy, dignity, and moral responsibility. The lessons they learned from observing this aftermath would likely shape their perception of justice, respect, and familial boundaries for years to come. Beyond the immediate family, the neighborhood and community felt the resonance of justice. The public nature of the exposure and the ensuing consequences provided a model of accountability. People who had been passive witnesses now understood the importance of intervention and acknowledgement of wrongdoing. The aftermath of this exposure reinforced communal awareness, ensuring that harm could not go unnoticed. The restoration of order, respect, and safety was no longer just a personal achievement, but a collective affirmation of moral boundaries and societal norms. Spiritually and emotionally, I found a renewed sense of purpose. The years of pain and humiliation could not be erased, but they were transformed into a story of resilience, justice, and dignity. The aftermath provided closure, not only for the suffering I endured, but for the larger lesson imparted to all who witnessed or heard of the events. The silence that followed the public exposure was profound, carrying with it the weight of consequence, the acknowledgement of truth, and the restoration of balance within the household and community. Reflection on the aftermath revealed the deep significance of courage, patience, and timing. Had I acted impulsively or without preparation, the lesson might have been incomplete or ineffective. By choosing deliberate, visible action, the consequences were undeniable and permanent. The aftermath of my decision demonstrated that justice does not require aggression, but requires clarity, evidence, and the courage to act. The peaceful calm that returned to the household and the community validated the strategy of public, undeniable exposure of wrongdoing. Over time, the household settled into a rhythm of quiet respect. My dignity, once compromised, was restored in both private and public spheres. The presence of consequences, acknowledgement by neighbors, and awareness within the community created an environment where abusive behavior could not thrive. I observed my son's attempts to rebuild reputation and relationships, but the memory of exposure and consequence remained a permanent marker. The aftermath served as a living lesson, reinforcing the importance of respect, accountability, and moral integrity. Emotionally, I felt a profound sense of relief. Years of fear, pain, and betrayal were addressed through decisive action. My voice, silenced for so long, had finally been heard and validated by authorities, community members, and my own conscience. The aftermath reinforced the principle that dignity cannot be surrendered, and that justice, when pursued thoughtfully, produces lasting results. I realized that the true victory lay not in humiliation or revenge, but in the restoration of safety, respect, and order. Physically, the marks of abuse slowly healed, but the memory remained as a reminder of endurance and resilience. Each bruise, each insult had contributed to the careful preparation that led to public exposure and the ultimate restoration of dignity. The aftermath confirmed that patience, evidence, and strategic action could overturn years of suffering. The transformation from a house of fear and disrespect to a space of calm and recognition of boundaries was profound, lasting, and empowering. The long-term effects of the aftermath extended to all relationships within the family. Trust, once broken, was now rebuilt on the foundation of accountability and respect. The son, humbled by exposure and consequences, had to confront his actions and the reality of the harm he caused. The household dynamic shifted fundamentally, with respect restored and abuse no longer tolerated. The community, aware of the events, reinforced the permanence of lessons learned through public and undeniable exposure. Finally, the aftermath demonstrated that justice, when pursued with courage, preparation, and evidence, transcends immediate relief. The lesson extended beyond punishment, embedding principles of dignity, accountability, and respect in the fabric of family and community life. My actions ensured that abuse could not continue unobserved, that truth prevailed over arrogance, and that the consequences of wrongdoing were witnessed, acknowledged, and remembered. Through the aftermath, my voice, once silenced, became a force of enduring justice, teaching lessons for generations to come. Now, as an old man, I look back at those years with a clarity that only time can give. The pain, the betrayal, the bruises, and the insults are all part of a story that shaped me. I realize now that love alone is not enough to protect oneself from cruelty or disrespect. Patience has its limits, and silence, while noble in some ways, can sometimes enable the guilty. Reflecting on every step, every decision, and every consequence, I understand that the courage to act and the wisdom to prepare were my true allies. The lesson of my life is clear. Respect must be earned, and boundaries must be enforced. Words can wound, and actions can destroy, but truth and justice endure. My son's claim that I was worth less than a dog could have left me broken if I had allowed it. Instead, I transformed insult and injury into decisive action. Reporting him, gathering evidence, and allowing public exposure was not about revenge. It was about reclaiming dignity and enforcing accountability. This reflection brings peace, because the outcome was not just punishment, it was a permanent lesson. I think about the years I spent giving everything for my son. Every sacrifice, every sleepless night, every moment of labor was intended to provide him a life of comfort, safety, and love. Yet, despite all of that, he chose disrespect and violence. It would have been easy to let anger consume me, to respond with equal cruelty. But I understood that the power of patience combined with evidence and strategic action is far stronger than the temporary satisfaction of retaliation. My reflection shows that lasting justice requires thought, courage, and clarity of purpose. Seeing him led away in handcuffs, under the eyes of neighbors, community members, and the very children who depended on him, brought an unspoken form of closure. The lesson was clear to everyone, not just to my son. My grandchildren learned that abusive behavior has consequences, that actions carry weight, and that even when the strong seem powerless, truth can prevail. Reflecting on that moment, I understand how crucial it was to ensure visibility, to allow the world to witness justice being served. The impact of exposure and accountability ripples beyond the immediate family, shaping values and awareness in the community. I remember the fear I felt during those years of abuse. Bruises hidden under long sleeves, insults swallowed in silence, and the constant uncertainty about the next outburst. But with reflection, I see that every moment of suffering prepared me for decisive action. It taught me resilience, strategy, and the importance of documentation. Evidence became my weapon, patience became my shield, and courage became my guide. These reflections remind me that even in the darkest moments, preparation and calm resolve can turn vulnerability into strength. Now, I value dignity over fear. My physical scars healed, but the lessons remain vivid. I have learned that self-respect cannot be surrendered, that passivity in the face of cruelty only empowers the guilty. Reflection also teaches humility, understanding that acting with measured decisiveness is more powerful than reacting in anger. I recognize that true revenge, if it is to be meaningful, must be about restoring order and teaching lessons, not merely punishing. My reflection reveals that the actions I took were as much about preserving my legacy as they were about addressing immediate wrongs. The process of reflection also highlights the importance of foresight. Every step, gathering evidence, documenting abuse, contacting authorities, was deliberate. Without preparation, the lesson might have been ignored or dismissed. But with careful planning, the truth became undeniable. Reflection allows me to see how patience and foresight, combined with courage, create consequences that cannot be evaded. My son's arrogance, which had once seemed unstoppable, crumbled under the weight of deliberate, strategic exposure. The reflection reveals the enduring power of preparation and wisdom over brute force or emotion. I also reflect on the emotional journey, the sorrow of betrayal, the heartbreak of seeing a child disrespect a parent, and the quiet satisfaction of witnessing accountability. Emotions were intense, but measured reflection allowed me to act with purpose. I see that my actions were necessary not just for me, but for the well-being of the household and the grandchildren. Their understanding of morality, justice, and respect was shaped by what they witnessed. Reflection reinforces that the consequences of wrongdoing extend beyond the individual to affect family and community, creating a broader lesson for generations. In looking back, I also understand the value of visible justice. My son's humiliation in front of neighbors and the community was not meant to destroy him, but to teach a vital lesson about respect and accountability. Reflection reveals that public exposure can be a powerful tool when used wisely, ensuring that lessons are internalized, acknowledged, and remembered. It transforms private suffering into public understanding, reinforcing ethical behavior and deterring future abuse. The reflection teaches me that courage coupled with strategy can shape not just individual lives, but also communal values. Reflecting further, I see the strength that comes from enduring pain without succumbing to despair. The journey from abuse and insult to restored dignity required patience, courage, and unwavering belief in the importance of justice. The scars, both emotional and physical, became reminders of resilience and determination. Reflection allows me to recognize that even the most degrading experiences can be transformed into lessons of empowerment, teaching both the guilty and the innocent about the consequences of their actions. Finally, my reflection encompasses gratitude for wisdom gained through hardship. I understand that suffering, when met with strategy and courage, can create clarity, strength, and a sense of justice that endures. The insult, worth less than a dog, could have defined the rest of my life in bitterness, but instead it became the catalyst for action, teaching, and restored dignity. Reflection confirms that truth, courage, and thoughtful action are the most enduring forms of power. Through these experiences, I have learned that respect, once lost, can be regained, and that even in old age, one can command authority, honor, and peace. Ultimately, reflection teaches that justice, dignity, and truth are timeless. The lessons I imparted and the actions I took shaped not just my immediate circumstances, but the values and understanding of my family and community. My son's behavior, once a source of pain, became a turning point that allowed me to reclaim authority, peace, and respect. Through reflection, I understand that strength is not measured by physical power, but by patience, preparation, and the courage to act when necessary. The final understanding is clear. Even a life filled with betrayal and insult can culminate in triumph through wisdom, action, and unshakable dignity.